Sometime in 1946, maybe 1947, a young shepherd boy from the West Bank of Palestine stumbled upon a cave. Inside the cave were a bunch of clay jars. They looked kind of like this one. This is a miniature replica. The jars were much bigger, more like 18 to 20 inches tall. Inside of these jars were various rolled up ancient scrolls of Jewish texts. The boy immediately recognized them as something significant, and so he brought them back home to his family, and they displayed them in their home, occasionally bringing them out to show visitors. At some point, they decided that they wanted to try and sell these scrolls to an antiques dealer, and after looking around, they found somebody to buy them. Later, some biblical scholar got their hands on these scrolls and immediately recognized them as very ancient texts of the Old Testament scriptures. They tracked down the original boy who found them, were shown the location of where they were, and then began to hunt around to look for more. The search was halted for a short period of time during a military conflict in the area, but soon the search was on for them to find more caves and more scrolls. After a while, they had found hundreds of scrolls over the series of about 12 different caves. Some of these scrolls were Old Testament scriptures written down. As we saw in the last video, near these caves was an archaeological site of an ancient settlement. The finding of these scrolls brought about a whole new interest in archaeological digging at this site, and it in general brought about new interest in the history and transmission of the biblical texts. Biblical scholars, as they looked at these texts, recognized that they were some of the oldest, actually were the oldest copies of many of the Hebrew scriptures that we have. And when they compared these texts to the Masoretic texts from nearly 1,000 years after these texts were created, the differences were there, but fairly minor. There were some differences that were major, but most were very, very small. So it proved to us that the history and transmission of the biblical texts is a far, far cry from a game of modern-day telephone. The texts were taken so seriously and copied with such accuracy that just mild variations usually cropped up, and most of those didn't change any of the direct meaning of the stories themselves, but maybe added little flares or details that weren't in later texts, or maybe flares that were in later texts weren't in the earlier texts. In part, these discoveries helped scholars to solidify a long tradition that the scribes who copied these texts took their job very seriously. It was a long-held legend that after the people of Judah returned from exile to Jerusalem out of Babylon, when Ezra read the ancient texts they found in the temple at that time in the public, that they had created new rules about the copying of these texts in order to make sure that they kept the authenticity and the integrity of the texts over generations. By most modern historians, these rules were considered to be merely a legend and were actually later created by the Masoretes as they attempted to preserve the texts that were handed down to them in the later half of the first millennium AD. But the Masoretes took great care in how they copied their texts. The rules that they followed were very strict. In fact, there was rules about the very sizes of the columns that could be on each page of a parchment. And there was rules about how wide the lines could be and how far apart characters were to be from each other and how far apart words were to be from each other and how far of space there needed to be between different books if copied onto the same scroll. All of these rules were added on to other rules about the scribe and their practice themselves. As they approached the process of copying the text, they were required to take a ritual bath to cleanse themselves before they would enter in and copy the text. They even took much care and reverence as they came upon every single Hebrew word that meant God. every time they came upon a word that meant God, they would wipe their writing instrument clean and dip it fresh to write that word. They took even more care when they came across the personal name for the God of Israel, Yahweh. In that instance, they would stop what they were doing and they would take a new ritual bath to cleanse themselves, come back, dip their writing instrument fresh, and start that name from the very beginning. These rules were important to the Masoretes and important potentially for generations before them in order to keep the accuracy of the text from generation to generation. If they made a mistake on one little letter, they were allowed to scrape that letter off and rewrite it. But if a more major mistake was made on a page, they would cut the entire parchment page off and bind a new sheath to where they had cut the old one off and start all over with that page. The texts were required to be reviewed by some other scribe within the next 30 days in order to certify it that it had no major mistakes and that it could be used in worship in the synagogues. The Dead Sea Scrolls may not have been created with these exact rules, but their consistency gives us some sense that the scribes who copied them took great care in their creation. When you compare these texts from the Dead Sea to the Masoretic texts from much later, there are some variations, and they help biblical scholars understand more about the transmission of the Bible over time. In fact, some of the variations in the Dead Sea Scrolls favor more ancient variations that we're aware of already, showing that there was various traditions. The Masoretes themselves were actually obsessed with the accuracy of their texts. And so they would often catch some of these variations that would creep up in their own texts and in their own traditions, and they would begin to put notations in the margins, standardized notations that acknowledge that different variations existed. And they would often point to which variations were thought to be more original. You can find notes like this in your modern day Bible, notes which will refer back to ancient manuscripts and variations found among different texts. In the end, we have no absolute proof of a perfect transmission of the text dating back to when the events happen. In fact, the furthest we can go back are still divorced from the original events by many hundreds, if not 1,000+ years. But what we do have is many other smaller evidences that scribes of more modern day in the mid-millennia AD, or even ancient scribes, took great care when they copied these texts over and over and over again, and that even the variations that were found were oftentimes mistakes. And even the more major variations that were found may have changed individual readings of portions of the text, but overall captured the story that was being conveyed in that text the same way or a very similar way as the text that we have today. The more evidence we gain from ancient manuscripts, the more we see how much these scribes cared about making sure the text they handed down were as accurate to the text they received in the first place. It was almost as if they believed that these texts were sacred and they gave them that kind of reverence. Who'd have thunk it?